I work for Wild Utah Project, which most of you have probably not heard of because we operate under the radar. And one of the main reasons that we exist is to provide can you not hear me in the back? Okay. How's that? Is that better? Okay. One of the reasons that we exist is to provide conservation science to Utah's other conservation groups. And you can pretty much name your group the science they need for their campaigns, as long as those campaigns align with our vision and our mission, which is to maintain and, where needed, to restore our natural lands in Utah and adjoining states. And we do this by providing the best conservation science to public land management. And so today, I'll be focusing on a kind of up-and-coming avenue within conservation science, which is landscape-scale, integrated land protection and management, and with a distinct focus on reconnecting severed and fragmented wildlife habitat. This new avenue can help our imperiled and native wildlife better cope with the upcoming changes that will be coming with climate change. And so to kind of put things in context, how did I come to this place to be working on wildlife and wildlands conservation and management? Well, I come to this place because of my passion for these beautiful and biodiverse places that I'm so fortunate to work in, including here last summer with my 4-year-old daughter, Kaya, who was assisting me on some beaver habitat assessments in the Fish Lake National Forest. And I desperately hope that these places are here for her when she grows up. And so a roadmap for the talk. What does conservation science tell us about fragmented wildlife habitat? What's the solution to this problem? What are these grand visions, these wildland networks? What's the science behind them? And how do you implement them on the ground? And how is everything that I will be telling you in the next half hour tie back into the real elephant in the room, climate change? So what exactly is wildlife habitat fragmentation? Of course, the easiest way to portray it is with photos like these, swaths of intact forest that presumably still house the species adapted to live there, alongside these patches of clear-cut stubble, which probably don't house those species. But what about this photo? Is this a fragmented landscape? I don't actually know the exact history of this picture, but we can probably presume that historically this was a native grassland that has been transformed over time into grazing pastures, mostly non-native grasses, and agricultural fields. Now, this landscape probably wouldn't pose a barrier to species like red foxes, jackrabbits, some kinds of sparrows, but it certainly would to pronghorn antelope who couldn't squeeze under that fence, or to any species of mammal or bird very closely tied to a specific seed from a native grass, or to any species known to decline with livestock grazing. So one thing to keep in mind with habitat fragmentation is that the human land use or modification that poses a barrier for one species may not be so much of an issue for another. And how about roads? How do they act to fragment wildlife habitat? Look at this map of New Mexico. Look at that road density, all those black lines. And I'm sad to say that maps of most of the other western states look no different. In terms of the very large interstate highways, the studies tell us that very small animals, like white-footed mice, will very rarely attempt to cross those highways, thereby effectively isolating populations of that species on either side of the highway. Now, with other sensitive species like lynx and wolverine and wolves, the studies tell us that it is actually road density that impacts these animals, whereas the number of roads per unit area, or in some cases the average use on those roads per day per unit area, are correlated with population declines of these species. And so basically the road density acts as a surrogate for maybe 10 different kinds of human disturbance, persecution, and degradation of habitat quality. So what you're left with is those white places on the map being the best places for species like grizzlies and lynx and wolves. But again, keep in mind, not all species mind a few roads. A great example are coyotes, who will pretty readily travel down sparsely used gravel roads, or in the winter, snow-packed or snow-plowed roads. And so summing up on this slide, a few of the causes of wildlife habitat fragmentation. And keeping in mind that some of these land uses, like agriculture and logging, will leave those patches of suitable habitat surrounded by swaths of unsuitable habitat. And some of these impacts, like roads and dams, will serve more often to sever the wildlife populations on either side of that impact. And this is just a graphic representation of that, where the first box there, an example could be a mining operation that punches holes in pristine sagebrush habitat, for example. And that second slide, that's your 4-lane interstate highway bisecting pristine wildlife habitat. And then the third example there, your classic forest clear cut, leaving what looks like islands of suitable habitat in its wake. Turns out most of the science that has been done that looks at the problems wildlife face when they're left in patches like this that are reduced in size is called the island effect. And what is considered to be the landmark study on this was done in the 1960s by Robert MacArthur on real oceanic islands. And what he found was that there were fewer species. He was looking at songbirds on the very small islands on the bottom part of the graph, and many more species of birds on the much larger islands at the top of the graph. And this graph here became known as the species area curve and became popularized and accepted, and actually led to a whole new field of ecology called island biogeography. And then in the 80s, when the field of conservation biology was born, conservation biologists began running around in terrestrial systems looking for these same patterns. And they were looking at everything from red-backed voles left in islands of clear-cut forests in the Pacific Northwest, looking at the numbers of species of rodents that remained in islands of sagebrush after a fire. And a study in San Diego by Michael Soule looking at a number of songbirds left in the coastal sagebrush chaparral, hemmed in by suburban development all around it. And in most cases, the species area curve was holding up, and what was really interesting were cases where the scientists could look at the islands right after they were formed by the development or the, is that better? Okay. Or the fire, and they could watch those islands over time and watch as the number of species went down. And this is what was known as the relaxation effect. And another study along these lines, a landmark study conducted by our very own Bill Newmark at University of Utah's Museum of Natural History. He looked at not the number of species, but the rates of extinction of our large mammals and carnivores in our Western North American national parks. And again, the curve held up. We're over here at the bottom of the graph. Only our very largest parks, and those two dots there are Banff and Yellowstone parks. Only the very, very largest parks were retaining their full complement of large mammals and predators. And then at the top of the graph, those dots up there, one of them is Bryce Park. They had lost some species such as fisher, lynx, grizzly. And Newmark's study was profound for a couple of reasons. And one is that, the matrix of land that surrounds most of our national parks is publicly owned forest lands and rangelands. But what this graph tells us is that those places are apparently not protective enough to retain their full component of biodiversity. And the other point that he made, I think, is this working? Yeah. Okay. Is that again, only our very, very largest parks are large enough to retain all the species that should be there. In fact, what Newmark was stumbling upon was what scientists worldwide were finding, and that it is our largest mammals, our migrational species, and our carnivores who suffer the impacts of habitat fragmentation the most. And this is manifested in so many ways, ranging from elimination of seasonal habitats or barriers between seasonal habitats, disruption of migration routes, just less prey to prey on. And to sum up how fragmentation impacts the species and the populations that are left in these habitat patches. At its simplest level, if you have less area to work with, you're going to have a smaller population, sometimes to the point where it gets so small it'll suffer various genetic effects, such as inbreeding. And then, of course, the flip side to that coin, if your area is so small that your population is so small that it winks out, then you see extirpation of a species within a patch. And then this brings in the issue of, well, how close is your patch to other patches or to a mainland patch? And if your population is so very small on that patch, can it be rescued, per se, from an individual coming over from a nearby patch? And so if you identify these as your basic problems with wildlife habitat fragmentation, what's the solution? Well, at its simplest level, the solution would be to reconnect those patches of habitat on the ground. And if you do this, you can prevent local extinction of populations through demographic rescue. You can provide for recolonization after local extinction. And you can basically let gene flow and seasonal migration continue to operate over an otherwise fragmented landscape. And this goes for ecological processes too, from seed dispersal to pollination to predator-prey interactions. So who out here has heard of the Wildlands Project? Okay. In the early 90s, a couple of our founding fathers of conservation biology, Reed Noss and Michael Soule, founded the Wildlands Project with a mission to reconnect severed wildlands and critical wildlife habitat across North America using this model here. And because this new movement was founded by silverback scientists, it's ever informed by the science of population biology, evolutionary ecology, and metapopulation dynamic theory, which I've talked about in the last slide. And what this science tells us is that we need to reconnect these core areas of habitat using functional landscape linkages between them in order to prevent further loss of our wildlife populations over the long term. And so what do these designs look like on the ground? Wildlands Project calls them Wildlands Network designs, and they come with a lot of names. And this is one of the first ones put out there by Reed Noss himself in the mid-90s for the state of Florida. And so you can design a wildlands network for any number of scales, an entire state, or maybe a county or city park system. And it doesn't have to be real fancy. This one's quite conceptual, obviously. In a nutshell, if your core areas are relatively large, intact, parcels of habitat that you know are important to a variety of species, and your linkage corridors make good sense, maybe along riverways, and they're wide and intact habitat, it'll serve the purpose that it needs to in terms of letting animals move across the landscape. And so there's a lot of ways to go about designing a wildlands network. And it can be simple, and sometimes it can be very complicated, and I can speak for an hour on the latest science using very complex computer models running simulated annealing algorithms, but I won't. But suffice it to say, a lot of thought and a lot of science has gone into how to develop these things. And the neat thing is that when you can implement them on the ground or come across patchworks of landscapes that look like this, you can test your theories on the reserve design. And you can look at very round patches versus long, skinny patches. Or, what's better, a few large core areas or several small core areas, all close together or far apart. And so you can look at what's happening with the populations in the core areas in terms of numbers of species. You can look at whether wildlife are actually using the linkages. And these are all studies that are happening. And this empirical research then feeds back in to how to better design these. And the latest and greatest method that's typically used these days is what's called the 3-track approach to wildlands network design, usually using a computer model. And basically, you're striving to have a good, even representation of all of your different vegetation types in your study area. You want to make sure they're represented in your core areas. And by the same token, those very rare species, those hot spots of biodiversity, assemblages of very rare plants, you want to make sure you capture those in your core areas too. And then thirdly, the focal species approach. Basically, if you're making sure that you pick up habitat for these kinds of species like prairie dogs and beavers that actually engineer habitats for other species, maybe indicator species that are indicative of a healthy functioning ecosystem, your top-level carnivores, species that are considered to be surrogate or umbrella species for others. If you're capturing the needs of these guys, you're going to capture the habitat needs of many species. And by that token, it's really important to focus in on that focal species approach as you delineate your corridors and your linkages. Because if those linkages are being used by keystone predators, umbrella species, migrational species, those that really need the riparian corridors, then it's going to work for many. And so, of course, you want to see an example of a wildlands network design. And so I'll start with the one that Wild Utah Project was involved in developing, and this is the Heart of the West Wildlands Network. It covers basically all of the Middle Rockies, and you can see Yellowstone Park at the top of the map, and coming down the west side through the Wasatch Front, along the Book Cliffs, north of the Colorado River. That's a different wildlands network design to the south of the Colorado River, and then back up through Wyoming to the Bighorns. And all of these green areas, these are all of the combined existing protected and proposed protected core areas. And we used the 3-track approach on this, making sure we had the different vegetation types represented in this final solution, the hot spots of biodiversity, and the needs for our focal species, such as wolves, cutthroat trout, and sage grouse. And the yellow areas are the linkages. And it's a very massive area, and it's a big map. But it was a joint effort where the Nature Conservancy developed the wildlands network for the mountainous areas, which is basically the Utah-Wyoming Mountains ecoregion, and the Heart of the West Coalition completed the design for the basins and lowlands and deserts, basically the Wyoming Basins ecoregion. And we stitched them up together because we used the exact same methods. And so we have this pretty map. And so what's next? How do you go about implementing a wildlands network on the ground? This map here shows the existing protected areas, national park and wilderness, shown in the dark green within the Heart of the West study area. It didn't show up really well. Can you see the lighter green? Okay. So those are the citizen wilderness proposals for the Heart of the West. And wilderness is probably one of the best bangs for the buck, assuming it's going to cover most of your proposed core areas. One of the best ways to implement a wildlands network. And the reason is, since wilderness by definition is roadless, and because conservation science tells us that roadless areas are probably almost the most important place to protect for biodiversity, for everything from predators needing to escape human persecution to very rare plants that are impacted by the exotic plants marching in on the roads. Wilderness is definitely the best bang for the buck. But wilderness doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. Just ask the Utah Wilderness Coalition about the Red Rock Wilderness Bill. And so you just can't put all your eggs into that holy grail basket of wilderness. And so you need to reach into your wildlands network implementation toolbox and use some other tools to protect those core areas and linkages. And a great one besides the legislative opportunities is administrative opportunities on federal lands, such as Forest Service resource natural areas and BLM areas of environmental concern. These offer great protection for important areas. State and county level initiatives like state parks and county parks, those are great too. The private land tools are some of the best tools for implementing a wildlands network, with MOUs and conservation easements for your core areas. And I'd also really would stress many administrative opportunities to gain just better land management. Things like Forest Service travel plans, where you can work for a lower density of ORV routes in your core area, or BLM grazing permit renewals, where you can work for better grazing management or lower stalking rates in that core area. But it's very critical that we don't just stop with, the core areas and linkages on this front. That matrix around the core areas and linkages, whether your design calls it a buffer zone or a compatible use area or whatever, if we can use these sorts of remedies to achieve a better and more protective public land management and those matrices, we can achieve habitat permeability for all kinds of wildlife to move between those core areas. So you won't have to rely on those 2 or 3 linkages that you were lucky enough to protect. And this last avenue here is where my group, we work the most. And so I just want to share just a couple other examples of these citizen-based wildlands network designs designed by the conservation groups. This is the one for the Southern Rockies, and it hooks into the bottom of the Heart of the West wildlands network I showed you a minute ago. And don't get bogged down with the color coding. It's just a lot of different fancy ways to label different cores and buffer zones, depending on whether they're private or public or existing or proposed. But the point is that they're well connected, and all of those polygons are important to work for better protection and land management. This one was designed by the Southern Rockies Ecosystem Project, and that network purposely overlaps with the one to the south, the New Mexico Highlands Wildlands Network. This one actually designed by Wildlands Project. And in the areas where these networks overlap, they have the same core areas, so it's the same vision. And again, don't get bogged down with the key. Those are all important places. And so what the Wildlands Project did was link up all of these citizen-generated wildlands networks. You can see the Heart of the West, New Mexico Highlands, Southern Rockies, and link them together in a grand vision called the Spine of the Continent. And part of this vision is that of a grizzly bear who can travel from the Yukon someday to the Yucatan in relatively unimpeded permeable landscapes without too many barriers. And these are all those wetlands network designs fleshed out together in the spine of the continent, where the green areas are already protected, and the yellow places are those proposed core areas. And there's a lot more yellow than green. And so we really have our work cut out for us, don't we? But I want to emphasize the power behind these maps, because they offer a long-term blueprint for better land protection and management that is scientifically defensible, because it's based on the best conservation science and the most recent resource data on the ground. And they offer a collective vision to how to go about implementing these things. And the conservationists who envision these wildlands networks, they know that the best way to get to this collaborative vision is to bring in the different stakeholders and land users and scientists together at the ground level as they begin to design these things, with mapping charrettes and workshops and stakeholder groups and expert peer review. And that's how these things are done, typically. And then once we have this collective vision, we can divvy up the work of implementation. So one group can be working on that statewide wilderness proposal. Another group can be working with Department of Transportation, looking at the key wildlife linkages that might be severed by certain roads. My group, again, we're really involved on the matrix, working on the habitat resilience and habitat permeability on public lands between the core areas. The private land groups can work on the conservation easements. We divvy up the work. So how effective is this design? How has implementation been going? Well, here's an example from the Southern Rockies Wildlands Network that I showed you, where they had identified in the central Colorado Rockies a problem with the linkage that links up the Eagle's Nest core area with the Holy Cross Wilderness core area. Basically, wildlife were getting hit on I-70 and still are. And this includes the new and growing lynx population in Colorado. And so the Southern Rockies Ecosystem Project convinced enough of our congresspeople in D.C. to pass a bill appropriating $500,000 to Colorado Department of Transportation to begin the analysis and feasibility study for what will be Colorado's first vegetated wildlife overpass. And there's the artist's rendering there at the bottom. And the picture on the right is where they're going to put it. And this is just a couple years away. And we know that these overpasses work from where they've been built before. It'll be millions of dollars, but it's coming, and that's a great success story. And then a similar implementation story in the New Mexico Highlands Wildlands Network, which I also showed you, where they had identified, again, a problem with the linkage linking up to proposed core areas. And this problem, again, was a large highway, Interstate 40, where wildlife, principally deer, were getting hit pretty frequently. And this linkage they considered so important and so endangered that an entire new conservation group popped up to work on it, the Tierras Canyon Safe Passage Coalition. And they convinced New Mexico Department of Transportation to pay for 5 miles of fencing on either side of the highway that ushered the deer into 3 existing underpasses that weren't being used. And they cleared all the vegetation out of them. And before the project went in 2007, there were between 25 to 35 instances of vehicle-wildlife collisions each year. And since they put that in 2007, there's been a total of 2. So, another success story. So, what do the federal and state agencies charged with most of our land management, what do they think of these Wildlands Project, Wildlands Network designs? Well, it depends which state you're talking about, but more often than not, the response is pretty favorable. And in fact, in Arizona, the Arizona Department of Transportation teamed up recently with Arizona Game and Fish, and they went about doing their own wildlands network called Arizona's Wildlife Linkages Project. And they brought all the stakeholders together. You can see Wildlands Project at the bottom. And here's the final design. And Wildlands Project was thrilled because the wildlands blocks shown in this design matched up very well with the same proposed core areas in the Sky Island Alliance's Wildlands Network design for southern Arizona. And because this project is spearheaded by Department of Transportation, they really focused on the main solution here being the underpasses for the wildlife. But they didn't determine where to put those underpasses just based on the roadkill data. That was part of it. They also implemented the cutting-edge technology of the least cost path model used by all sorts of scientists in this sort of work doing wildlands networks to determine where the most important linkages for wildlife were. And turns out they were the places where wildlife were also getting killed. So the Wildlands Project was thrilled with this. And a quick note, turning to Florida, this is what Reed Noss's design in the mid-90s has evolved into. And up until a couple years ago, the state of Florida was appropriating on average $300 million a year for land protection within the state, focused mostly on these proposed core areas. In one of the most amazing implementation stories I could have ever have dreamed, until the state went broke 2 years ago with the financial crisis, but still impressive. Okay, so how do these wildlands network designs, how will these help with our challenges with climate change? Well, what's going to be the main challenge faced by our wildlife in the face of climate change? Well, we're already seeing the response, and there's tons of studies that are already showing that many wildlife species are already shifting their ranges to the north and upwards in elevation in response to changes in the plant community. And so we also know from these studies and these models that these species aren't going to shift in tandem as a community, but probably individually across the landscape. And that makes it all the more critical that we work to provide for functional movement pathways in these landscape linkages between existing core areas. Because if we don't, the scientists tell us that we will begin to see, with climate change, extirpations of many species within our protected areas. And just an example here is the current range of jaguar today. And one of these many models based on projected precip patterns with climate change tells us where jaguar will be in just 40 years. And while species are going to be attempting to shift their ranges northward and upwards in elevation, the human population is going to still be growing. Here again is the spine of the continent with our proposed protected areas, with an inset here of the Colorado Plateau, which Tom Sisk was talking about. And most conservation biologists love to live on the Colorado Plateau because they think there's no people there. But across the spine of the continent, and even on the Colorado Plateau, in just 20 years, we're going to have much more population growth, and this means further encroachment onto what little wildlife habitat remains. And so we've been told by our climate scientists that we need to act very quickly to reduce our CO2 emissions to avert what could be catastrophe. But now we have the conservation scientists telling us we might need to move just as quickly to shore up our protected areas for wildlife and make sure that there's ways that they can move between them, or we could have a similar catastrophe. Not just extirpations within protected areas, but extinction of entire species. And I don't want to end on such a grim note, because the examples from Arizona and Florida show us that we can do this. So let's do it. That's it.